about the Jewish tradition, because early Christianity comes out of the roots of Judaism. And when we talk about art in Judaism, we have to talk about these things called the Ten Commandments. And there is in the commandments a phrase that many people forget, that goes, "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image." And to grave just means to rub something along a surface, leaving a mark. So be that a pencil or a tool on stone. "Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth." So basically what we're talking about is thou shalt not make representational imagery. And this goes on to discuss idolatry, but I want to point out that it's pretty clear that you're not supposed to make images of things in nature based on that section of the commandment. And because of this, Judaism is what we call an aniconic tradition. So for most of history, Jewish art has avoided showing figural images, images of people, especially religious figures. And at some points, you have just images of nothing but things that were man-made. We're finally getting around to the era of early Christian art. One of the things that I like about this is that you no longer have to worry about the AD, BC thing, because everything dealing with Christ and after is AD. Now, before we jump into Christian art, I want to talk a little bit, and just to show you a few aniconic works of very old Jewish art. Here is a glass bottle from Syria, and it's just got decorative patterns on it. It was not uncommon to show images of menorahs or Torah scrolls, or the artwork that was being made by Jews, which tends to be metalwork that is purely ornamental rather than representational. So, but every once in a while they would show that stuff in their art. Most synagogues are decorated with a lot of ornament, but not representational imagery. Unfortunately, because of the long history of persecution of Jews, we don't have that many early synagogues around. I am going to show you one, though. Now, so Christianity grows from the roots of Judaism, and we might expect that it would be an aniconic tradition as well. But Christianity is anything but an aniconic tradition. In fact, it's a good 1,500 years before people start to debate whether you should have imagery or not in Christian churches. To sort of understand what's going on with Christianity, I want to, and early Christian art in particular, I want to look at some Jewish art that was made at the same time that Christianity was developing. Christianity develops in the Roman Empire. So it's an area under Roman control. And the Romans made lots of representational art and had it in a lot of public places. In fact, representational art was so common in the Roman Empire that even people who were traditionally aniconic would every once in a while sort of abandon that tradition and adopt the representation of Rome. And in a city called Dura Europa, or Dura Europus, and this is a city that is in modern-day Syria, and we don't know what's going on with it exactly today. We really hope it survives, because it is an amazing cosmopolitan city that was under control of Rome. You see this great Roman road plan, but it also had a lot of different types of people in it, so it's one of those examples of the diversity of the Roman Empire. And there were loads of different temples, some of them dedicated to Greek or Roman gods, some of them dedicated to Near Eastern gods, and it also had a synagogue, and there was a house that was a private kind of secret church. The synagogue at Dura Europa is one of the rare examples of representational or iconic Jewish imagery in an actual religious building. It is decorated with scenes that show Aaron, that show Moses, painted with frescoes all over the walls. And most people believe that this is just something that happened when you had this overwhelming culture of Rome that had so much representational imagery. I liken this to speeding. Most people who drive an automobile in the U.S. speed. There are places in the world where people don't speed. But in the U.S., we tend to speed. I'm not saying it's a good idea. And we speed because everyone speeds. And you can be driving down the road thinking, I don't want to speed, but you're going to end up speeding because you're just going with the flow of traffic, and then you realize that you're going way too fast, and then you slow down. But it just becomes almost second nature to at least go 5 miles above the speed limit on the highway. Please don't do that in residential areas. But this is what happens with the Jews of Dura Europa, exposed to so much religious art that's representational. They just sort of go with the flow. And there are a few other periods in history where we see similar synagogues made. One was under the Byzantine Empire. But Dura Europa is the most famous. And keep in mind that Christianity is starting to take off right at the same time that Dura Europa is founded and this synagogue decorated around 160 AD. This is when Christianity is taking off, and the very same thing happens with Christian art. So while Christian theology is very firmly based in Jewish theology, thus the holy texts of Judaism form much of the Old Testament of the Christian Bible. So Christianity theology is from Judaism, but the artistic roots of Christianity are very squarely in Roman art. And I'm going to say classical art because Roman art was based on Greek art to some extent, but that's where you're going to get the roots of Christian art. And in fact, the private home that was used as a church in Dura Europos also had similar frescoes on its walls. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a number of artworks that were made in Rome or on the Italian peninsula by early Christians and compare them to Roman monuments. What I'm showing you right now is actually a Roman pagan room. It's from one of those insulas owned by one of the really wealthy plebeians, and it's decorated everywhere with frescoes. And I just want you to look at the ceiling to see that format of the ceiling painting. This is something that is replicated in a very famous painting in a Christian gathering site. And what we're looking at here is that same exact format, but it's in a catacomb as opposed to a home. And the catacombs were burial places. They were underground in Rome. There are catacombs in other cities too. And this is one of the places that early Christians would gather because they couldn't be persecuted. Well, they could be persecuted, but early Christians would gather in the catacombs as opposed to other places because people tend not to hang out in underground places where bodies are buried. So it was one of those places that it was very unlikely you would be discovered. When we look at the art in the catacombs, which is where we find most early Christian art, when we look in those catacombs, the art that we're going to look at is going to be clearly based on Roman models. And if you think about it, if you were a Roman walking through these catacombs, you might not realize that what you were looking at was Christian art, thus even further reducing the possibility of the Christians being persecuted when they were found in the catacombs, because people wouldn't know they were Christian. We're going back to the Catacomb of Saints Peter and Marcellinus, and I've already made the point that this is formatted like a Roman ceiling painting. I've made the point that early Christians gathered in catacombs because that was a bit safer than most places for them. And now I'm going to show you individual parts of this painting, which is clearly based on Roman precedents. And keep in mind that the early Christians were hiring Roman artists. Whether the artists knew they were painting Christian stuff or not, we don't know. But I'm going to look at different parts of the painting and how they derive from Roman precedents, or Greek precedents in certain cases, and then talk about the format of the painting as a whole. So at the very center there is an image of a man with a sheep over his shoulders and surrounded by sheep. That is Christ as the Good Shepherd, and it relates to some parables in the Bible. But if you were a Roman, you would see this as possibly an image of a philosopher or teacher who were commonly compared to calf bearers because they were helping their students or guiding their students. So, and also philosophers were shown this way. So if you've got Roman knowledge, you're looking at a philosopher, teacher, etc. If you are a Christian, you might see this as Christ. Surrounding that main scene are three scenes that could be seen as either Jonah and the whale, or as a story of Dionysus and pirates. So if you see this with Christian eyes, you see a guy being tossed off a boat, being swallowed by a sea creature who looks mysteriously like a dog with a fish body, but they did not have a lot of whales to look at, okay? So we're going to give them a little slack on that. And then you see a scene with the man on land, and you can see this as Jonah, who is thrown off the boat because the sailors come to believe that he is that God's mad at him, basically, and thus they're having a lot of storms. Jonah in the story gets swallowed by a whale for 3 days, and then agrees to do God's bidding, and gets safely to land. So you can see those images as that. Or if you're a Roman, you might see this as the story of Dionysus and the pirates. Dionysus was kidnapped by pirates. The pirates, Dionysus forced the pirates to leave the boat, and they got turned into dolphins, or porpoises or something, and that's what we're seeing up here. And that might be a way of interpreting that half human body and sea creature thing in the other vision. And then when you look at the final scene on the catacombs wall, you notice that it's a man under grape arbor, and you could see that as Dionysus, the god of wine. Among the scenes, there are 4 figures who have their hands up. They are called orant figures, and they are orators. They are people who are speaking and spreading the word of Christ. They are the 4 gospel writers. Actually, you only see 3 because part of the ceiling's been destroyed. But you see those 3. There was presumably a 4th. Whenever you see 4 guys either writing or talking in Christian art, you have to think a little bit about the 4 gospel writers. Finally, what we're looking at here is something that's very, very common in early Christian art and in Christian theology overall, and that is typology. Typology is when you look at the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament. So you take your knowledge of the New Testament of Christ and apply it to how you interpret the Old Testament. In this case, the story of Jonah and the whale is a reference to Christ, who leaves the earth for 3 days and then is resurrected. He is seen as a prototype or a forerunner of Christ that will tell us what will happen when Christ is on earth. Typology is very common in modern theology, and it was very common in early Christian art. I just wanted to show you a few other images from catacombs. These are some paintings of presumably the Last Supper or 13 Roman guys having dinner. Depended on what lens you used when you look at it as you're walking through the catacombs. Christianity was legalized in 313 and very quickly spreads in the Roman Empire. So quickly, in fact, that by 359, the prefect of Rome, who's kind of like the mayor of Rome, is a Christian, and he decides to have a sarcophagus made for himself, which was not unusual among Romans, and it was very common among Christians who felt they were going to be bodily assumed into heaven. On that sarcophagus, he has a variety of scenes shown. And he very knowingly picked out the scenes that would be shown and created what we call a program. So a program is a selection and arrangement of scenes, and both the selection of what you chose to show and the way you arrange them is important. For the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus, what we're looking at here in this sculpture that has that great late Roman style where the figures are all a bit shorter and stocky, it's a little bit cartoonish. What we're looking at are a series of scenes from both the Old and New Testament. So I'm going to start on the left-hand side, where at the top you have Abraham and Isaac. And I'm going to give you really, really brief descriptions of these stories. Okay. Abraham is a chosen of God. They have a whole covenant going on. And at one point God says, Abraham, sacrifice your son. In the Christian and Jewish traditions, that is Isaac. And so Abraham is going to kill his son, who he waited a really long time to have. And then at the last minute, an angel comes in and says, oh, no, you can kill that ram instead. So there's Abraham. Down below him is Job, another Old Testament figure, who loved God. And then God and Lucifer got in this little bet about whether Job loved God because Job's life was great, or whether Job would love God despite having, losing everything. And so they start to take stuff away from Job. His family dies or abandons him. He loses his health. He loses his wealth. But he still loves God. And what we're seeing in these two scenes furthermost to the left are scenes of people who passed a test, passed some kind of divine test. Next to them, you have some people who don't do very well. So we have the A+ students in that first section, and then we have some students who fail miserably in the next section. St. Peter, who claimed that he would never deny Christ, yet denied Christ 3 times before the cock crowed. Meaning he said, I don't know that guy that you arrested. No, I don't know him. He is being arrested there, so. And down below him are Adam and Eve. They were forbidden to eat from the tree of knowledge, and yet they did. So they got kicked out of the Garden of Eden. So you seem to have some things about people being tested over on that side. If we go over to the right-hand side, the 2 scenes across the top show Christ before Pilate. This is when Pilate condemns Christ to death because he says Christ has claimed to be the King of the Jews. So Christ is being falsely condemned. Down below, you see 2 scenes of people who were also had to suffer consequences for their beliefs. or their actions. Daniel, who is put in a lion's den because he will not worship the God of his king. And St. Paul, who will not worship the Roman emperor. And Daniel survives the lion's den. And by the way, if you ever get to see the VeggieTales version of this, it is hysterical. So not only in the VeggieTales, not in the Bible, but in the VeggieTales version, Daniel makes buddies with the lions, and they have a Friday movie night, and they order pizzas and stuff like that. It's pretty funny. But so here you see, the false condemnation of people compared to the false condemnation of Christ. And Daniel is Old Testament, St. Paul is New Testament. Then in the center, you're going to have the most important stuff, and in the center you have Christ. Down below, he's entering Jerusalem, which will lead eventually to his death. And then up above, you see Christ enthroned. And what happened in early Christian art was that a lot, especially once Christianity is legalized, a lot of the images of Christ start to take on the aspects of images of emperor. And if you think about this, this makes a lot of sense. Not only was the emperor the most respected figure among the Romans, and thus an appropriate sort of prototype for showing Christ or someone that you respect, but the emperor was also considered both man and God, just as Christ was. And what you see here is Christ enthroned, and he's got some scrolls that link him to the administration of justice or judgment. Ironically, he is on a throne that is very, very Roman, and in fact is a polytheist kind of throne. That guy that Christ is stepping on is actually a river god, and that was a common thing to show in Roman thrones. This leads us to believe that the sculptor was not a Christian, because a Christian would know you only show one God. Another effect of the legalization of Christianity is the building of churches. You start to have public churches instead of hidden or private places of worship. So the Christians no longer need to worship down around the dead bodies in the catacombs. They no longer need to sort of secretly go to houses to gather. Instead, they can build public buildings. And the first church to be built within the walls of Rome is Old St. Peter's. It no longer survives. That's why we call it Old St. Peter's. There is a new St. Peter's that replaced it when it started to fall down. But Old St. Peter's is a very important church. It was a church that was commissioned by Constantine and thus indicated the acceptance of Christianity in the Roman Empire. And when this Roman emperor commissions the Christian church, he uses a classic Roman format for that church. Old St. Peter's is based on a basilica floor plan. And if you look to the left, you see that there is an apse. There is a nave. They've added a couple aisles on there, which is fine. And then, in order to make a Christian symbol out of the floor plan, they extended a transept across the front of the church. So it's basically basilica plus transept, and you have a Christian church. And the format of the basilica works very well, because if you have someone in that apse, they can look out over that broad expanse of the nave. I've included a drawing here for you. So someone standing in the apse could see what was going on in the nave, and all the people in the nave could look towards the apse and see the few religious figures up there who were administering a service to the faithful in the nave. So that basilica format is very functional, and this is going to be a style of church that people use for a very, very, very long time. You might notice out to the side of the floor plan that there are a couple round buildings. They were buildings built to go along with the church, but they are in a format that we call a central plan. Central plan buildings were also kind of popular for early Christians because the early Christians had a belief in death in one life and a rebirth in the next. And the central plan building had started out with that building for Mausoleus's remains. So it starts out with a reference to death and thus rebirth. So that central plan for Christians is associated with rebirth. And it's not surprising then that when Constantine built a church for the remains of his daughter, Constanza, he used the central plan. And a lot of these central plan churches will maintain that reference to rebirth. Another type of building that was very common to have in a central plan was a baptistry, which is where you die in one life and are born into a life with Christ. You might notice in this church, which is called Santa Costanza, the ceiling mosaics maintain a lot of references to things Roman. They have little putti, although in this case we would call them angels, and there are lots of grape leaves. Those grapevines, which in Roman images are associated closely with Dionysus, in the churches are associated with the wine which will become the blood of Christ. So I just want to go through a few of these terms and give you a sense of how you can look at these churches. We're looking at a church called San Apollinare Nuovo, and very common early Christian church. This is a basilica plan church, and you should be able to identify all the parts of this church, both in an interior view and on a floor plan. So just going over the parts of the cathedral, this central area between the two arcades, going all the way up to the ceiling, I've only highlighted the floor of it, but that central area is called the nave. Behind the arcades, you have those areas between the columns and the outer walls. Those are the aisles. And then up front, in that little recessed area, you have the apse. That's where the clergyman would stand, and then you'd have all the faithful out in that nave. Very functional. Everyone can see what's going on, or at least most people can see what's going on. And at certain points in time, you're going to pay more to sit up front because you had to pay for your place to sit in the church and stuff. But that was later. But everyone can more or less see what's going on with the clergyman up in the front, and then you have that big nave area for the people to watch. And I want to note that this church has a tall tower that is round next to it, and that was a baptistry. So that's the basilica-style church, functional, central plan, where you really don't know where to stand or where an altar should go. That is symbolic. So a little bit about some of the images that were made to go in the churches. The early Christians, once Christianity is legalized and they are decorating churches, they tend to prefer mosaics over paintings. Mosaics are a bit more durable at this time, and since the early Christians weren't terribly interested in naturalism, they don't do a lot of shading in their work. They're not really interested in showing space. Instead, they want to tell stories clearly. That's what we're going to see in their artwork. Here we're looking at a mosaic that shows Christ as a good shepherd. And once again, Christ is being shown in a way that is very much related to the way emperors were shown at this time. One of the things that you see on this image of Christ is this gold round circle around his head that you want to call a halo, don't you? But we're not going to call it a halo yet, because that circle behind the head was a common Roman image to indicate that someone was divine. It shows up in a lot of other cultures' art, but this very round gold or sun-like thing behind a head starts out as an indicator that something is divine, like Sol Invictus, who is a indefeatable sun god that I'm showing you in this sculpture down below, and you can see what we call a nimbus there, and it derives from a reference to the sun's glow. Up above, you see Christ has that gold circle, and then over on the left, on this Roman coin, which shows the emperor, you have the same nimbus indicated. And that's one of the common things that was used to show that emperors were both man and divine. So that gets taken over for images of Christ. Another thing that you're going to see on images of Christ quite a bit are bits of purple on the clothing. And some of the purple was actually made out of porphyry tessera. Porphyry is that purple stone that was used on the Tetrarch statue. It was also used on parts of Constantine's arch, and you can see the darker stone up around the medallions that had been taken from Hadrian's monument. And that was that purple stone that was associated exclusively with the emperor. Purple was also a color of cloth that was sometimes by law only used by the emperor or given when you had curried favor with the emperor. So it was another imperial indicator. And finally, on that image of Christ that I showed you, once again you see Christ seated as if he is in a throne. They're not showing a throne, but he's seated as if he is in the throne. And actually this seated pose with one hand up and one hand out was commonly used for Roman emperors, and also for the god Zeus, who was the leader of the gods. Eventually someone's actually going to use that pose to show George Washington in a very bizarre sculpture, but you'd have to take Art 1B to find out about that. Just another image from an early Christian church. Here is the betrayal of Christ, or the kiss of Judas. You see once again Christ in the purple robes, and I know it looks kind of brownish, but that was porphyry. With the nimbus, he's slightly taller than the others, but not much taller. And the point of this image is not to make something that is very realistic, the way the Romans had done in their fresco paintings or in a lot of their sculpture, but to make something that tells a story clearly. You have Christ in the center. He's easy to identify. You can tell that the guys who have the same kind of clothing as him are all referencing Christ or related to Christ somehow. So all the guys in those white long dresses or togas are similar to Christ, but one of them is on the other side with the guys in the short garments who are the bad guys. And this takes visual means and uses it to tell a story clearly, because there is going to be a Christian doctrine that images are okay. And that images are okay because they teach the Bible to the illiterate. And since most Christians were illiterate, because learning how to read and write was very expensive, this kind of clarity is something that we're going to see in early Christian art, and then again when we look at Byzantine art. Okay, I hope this all recorded, and you can move on now to the Byzantine lecture.